This is Synopsis, a series of conversations in the framework of Abeceda Institute. My name is Neža Zupanc, and today with me is Daniel Lee Chappell. Welcome, and kindly ask for a short introduction, especially in terms of, with emphasis on your musical formation and how you became a composer.
Sure. So my name is, I said, Daniel Lee Chappell. I'm a composer and pianist based in the UK. I've been composing really since I was about, I guess, kind of 6 or 7 years old. I got my first keyboard. I'm going to the whole story, but basically, when I got the keyboard, nobody in my family was a musician. Nobody could read music. We didn't have any musical books. So I basically just started improvising, playing around, trying to find ways to notate any sounds that I liked and wanted to recreate in a very kind of basic form, like improvisation or composing. And then as I kind of went through that, after a short period, I started having piano lessons, learning music theory, learning how to read and write music. So really, it's something that's been with me for pretty much my entire musical life from that point. It wasn't really something I thought of as being kind of like special or unusual, really until I became a teenager and went to music school and realised that wasn't something that many people did, particularly at that age, or felt comfortable with. It was often something that people felt a bit hesitant about. But yeah, it was just something that I was really drawn to, and I didn't really think anything of it. And it just kind of grew as I grew as a musician.
Do you remember how you came to, I don't know what it was, realization or seeing it as a fact that there needs to be notation? Because many times in my memory, musicians start with playing on the instrument, but not so often notating down immediately. Do you remember of your conception of that? Probably you cannot exactly, but do you have any memory of that?
I actually can, because my first keyboard was a little Casio keyboard that my dad found someone who was throwing it out. It was broken, and he repaired it, fixed like this little component that's broken, and that was my first instrument. And I remember that I did get like a little music notation book and no idea what the lines meant and the step notation was. I think someone had explained to me that they used the letters of the alphabet, but I didn't quite understand how that mapped onto the keyboard. So I think I just wrote random letters down, however it sort of made sense to me intuitively. And things like, if I put the button that says like salsa, put the salsa beat on and press this note, I quite like the sound of it. So it was basically just me writing down which buttons to press to make a particular sound. So that was really like the earliest forms of notation. And I'm pretty sure somewhere, like my parents have kept that book I had when I was about 6 years old, with this very sort of, I'd probably like quite idiosyncratic notation that I probably struggle to make sense of now.
Right, because that was my next question. Did you ever got to analyze what you wrote down in those early years?
No, I mean, I know I did look back at it at some point. I think as a teenager, probably when I was sorting through a bunch of books. I didn't really start writing kind of properly notated music for a couple of years, and I think it was really when I went to music school at the age of 11, and as part of my application for that, I put together a portfolio of compositions, like piano compositions, that I sort of had memorized, and improvised and kind of worked through that way, and then thought, oh well, okay, I need to write these down. And because I'd only ever come across printed like typeset music, I had very high standards of what notated music should be like. So now if you look at my my like handwritten score, in fact, get some here. What's this? I have no idea what this is, but it's legible, but kind of typically scruffy. But
arguably.
Yeah.
For some, it's perfection, huh?
But I mean, I meticulously wrote everything out in pen, and it took days and days and days to notate. And I remember being very, very pleased that I had this little suite of piano pieces in it. I got past 100 bars. It felt like a real milestone.
Mm-hmm. So you are one of the composers that are still using pen and paper and writing everything down. At what? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of work between kind of paper and pencil and notation software. The process changes depending on the piece, depending on the circumstances, and how much time I have to kind of get something from notation to the finished product. So typically, I'll start out with pencil and paper and start writing. If it's maybe like small fortes, piano, or like chamber group, kind of writing into full score essentially from the beginning. And then at some point, I'll start kind of going through and typesetting that. And at some point, the typesetting tends to overtake where I'm at with the manuscript, and I'll start working into the manuscript. Mm-hmm. So into the notation software. And I find I like the freedom of handwriting, because you really can just write anything down however you like, and you don't have to bend the computer system to your will, which can be a bit of a challenge. But equally, what's quite nice about working with any kind of computer software, whether it's at the moment it's mostly Sibelius, but I have worked with like DAWs and things, is that you can map out time in a very sort of precise way. So that can be quite good for structure. In many cases, I can think, I know that this bit of material I have goes there, and I've now got this other bit of material, and I know that's going to make the sort of the midpoint or the climactic point, and I have some idea maybe where that is. So I can start to plan out these milestones and put those into the software, and then sort of have some idea at least of, I know I've got this span of time or this number of bars, and that can help to start to like make things feel a bit more set. Whereas when it's on manuscript paper, it can still feel a little bit kind of free and up in the air, a little bit abstract.
Can you speak more to the time and structure connection? One of the ways that I tend to attempt providing insights into or finding where we can offer an insight into your work for anyone that is listening is through those elements of notation, if not composition. And here you mentioned structure and time. How precisely do you time the structure or parts of structure, and how come, let's say, if nothing was assumed, you come to this being tightly connected?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's a very practical part of that, which is that I tend to always write for a particular event or performer or group. And so with that commission, there's a sense of it's got to be about this length of time. This piece has to be really for 5 minutes slot, a 10 minute slot, whatever. And it's always a little bit flexible, but you never really want to go way overshoot or realize, I was supposed to have this 15-minute long piece, and actually I've only got 4 minutes, and I thought it'd be a lot longer, and it's not. So it's that's part of what it's about. But I became really interested in structure when I studied my postgraduate with Kenneth Hesketh at the Royal College, and that was a point where I was kind of at a bit of a dead end, I think, with what I was doing as a composer. I'd done a lot of composing as a teenager, and that felt really like my thing that I did as a musician. I moved into doing a lot more performing at undergraduate, and I actually really struggled composing. What I found is that I have these little short motifs, phrases, almost kind of like classical formula style. Here's 8 bars of music, now contrast it with another 8 bars of music, and it just felt very bitty. It felt like everything was like stopping and starting. So one of the first pieces I began working with when I studied my postgraduate was a piece called Archaelis, which is a mixed sextet, and it was really like just kind of diving into ideas of like process music, and because of that, structure just started to become very integral to the work I was doing with that and like several subsequent works, because you start off on this this path really, and it's something that essentially like you can keep going. Like you know, at some point this process is going to finish or this piece is going to finish, and so then you have to start thinking like, what is the arc of this, and where does some other process take over or change something? And that was just a very helpful process for me to go through, moving from what I think Ken sort of referred to as like a worm's eye view of this very narrow, like note by note, like stitching things together very, 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 very fine and getting it quite stuck, and actually thinking about, you know, where is this leading to? So with that like Archaelis piece, it was that first kind of process piece, the first time I was exploring microtones, which is a new kind of harmonic language for me, and it actually, like, I really needed to have that because of these certain structural points in the piece that helps me think, okay, I know that this is going to go to there, and then this is going to like come down in that way, and then I had all these like mechanisms, like machines that were happening, and it just kind of helps put these pillars in place. And once those pillars were in place, there was still lots of like filigree work to go between them, but it just made everything make so much more sense, really made it possible to get from one end to the other. And then that carried on through like a sort of sequel piece almost that I wrote after I graduated called Opera Orchestra, and quite a lot of my other work. It was quite important in the work I did for abeceda last year, the Purification of Time. So it's sort of become almost like a bit of a preoccupation, I think, for a lot of the music that I've written since then.
And if this is the first piece where you are working with processing, how does that, let's say if you speak to your compositional process, and one of my questions was, where's for you the first tangible moment of a composition, maybe on a particular piece, or if you have a universal for your practice answer, perhaps also a universal. Where's the first tangible moment of the composition, and how you develop from there? What are the processes you go through? And then on this composition that you say is the first one with processing, how does that affect the compositional process of yours?
It's probably helpful to talk about both the Archaelis and Epiradialis as a kind of like companion pieces at the same time, and they both actually came back in a similar way.
Could you first shortly address the names?
Sure, okay. Titles are my least favourite part of being a composer. So I like so many titles have basically just been like the last thing I do before the deadline, and I've like tried like dozens and dozens of
to have them as the first thing to get out of the way.
Yeah, so it's just something that because I think particularly with these process pieces, I think about various kind of, they might be like natural or biological or geological processes, weird like abstract things that I sort of make a lot of sense in my head, but I can't put into words. So essentially, like they are basically just made up words, which makes them very unique. But they were also derived through a process of kind of quite lengthy research from the start to the end of the piece, of trying to conceptualize like what are these pieces, what do they mean to me, and what kind of objects or activities or processes like do I feel really connect with what I'm trying to do musically and compositionally. And then I'll sort of start iterating, like getting like a bunch of words, like a word sort of soup, and mixing them together, and kind of as the piece goes along and I think about different things and I mean, I get this sort of made up amalgamation of many, many words. So I think that archaeoliths is, like one of them, for example, is like monolith. That was like a word because I thought it was this big slab of thing that's sort of carved. But I know there were like at least a dozen other things that went into that. And the same thing with epiradialis, you know, this sort of, the word like radial is kind of quite present in there. So it's still quite an abstract thing that sort of has meaning to me. And I'm quite interested in sort of meaning and the abstract and the subjectivity of experience. So what I like about having these titles is, I mean, even I can't remember exactly how I arrived at each word, but it's something that I can project something myself on, and each person, as they listen to the piece, can project something themselves. And I think that's quite important for what I think of as kind of like my compositional practice is. I'm not someone who sort of, I don't like to force perspective on the audience and say this piece of music is about this and I want you to feel this way or think this way. To me, I think a lot of the experiences I've had with music where it's really meant something quite deep to me, I also recognise that that is not the work of the composer by themselves and not even the work of the performance by themselves, but actually like, I'm a big part. It's what I brought to a performance on a particular day that has really affected me in that way. And so when I think about that's kind of the effect that I want to recreate with my music, I have to accept that I can't make someone interact with my music in that way. I simply have to kind of allow them this very like abstract like vessel in which they can place their own experiences into it. And the titles are therefore like quite a big part of that, in trying to be abstract yet evocative, sort of almost familiar, you know, being derived from like existing words, but then you can't explicitly define them.
Fantastic. Thank you. Now back to the question.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So this was about kind of the start of the piece and how it works from there. So both these two pieces started with they actually started kind of in the middle, or almost like the climactic point actually. So I started writing, like sketching some ideas, essentially a little like harmonic schema, you know, maybe like 8 bars or something of a pattern that could then be like extended and extended. And so in a sense that is kind of straight into the middle of the piece. And I know when I'm writing this and I have a sense that this is not how the piece starts. I now have to find a way of getting to this moment. And yeah, that I think with Archaeoliths it was actually like slap bang in the middle. I think Epiradialis, it's sort of about 3/4 of the way through. It's like the climactic point at the end, and then it's all a sort of, I would say like a mathematical kind of derivation, but not using a mathematical process, but that thing of like, here's the material that I have. What is the process that has arrived at there, which might be kind of an extension or augmentation of rhythm, of harmony. I think with Archaeoliths, it was like very particular vertical harmonies that I had. So this is the chord that it starts at here, and I feel like this is the middle. And then as I extend this process further into the future, I have at this point here, and then I thought, well, okay, if that's the midpoint, that's the end point. It either sort of carries on in the same direction backwards through time, or this is like the most expansive point that it compresses, which is actually what happens. It starts narrow and it kind of works its way up that way, and then sort of back that way, through like several processes. With Epiradialis, there's this sort of chorale at the beginning, which is basically exactly the same harmony as the climax at the end, but the rhythm is sort of slightly skewed and more more sort of to the grid, basically. I forget what the term is. But basically, it's all done in sort of these quaver and dotted patterns, and then it becomes much more free flowing. So I now know that there's a rhythmic process that has to happen to get from the beginning to the end, and then I start kind of mapping that out, and then kind of filling in pictures as I go along. And there's still a huge amount of intuition that goes into that, but it's essentially setting these the boundaries of the space in which the music is going to work.
Does this base? Okay, you mentioned intuition. Does this also base on a certain idea, or not necessarily idea in a sense that it's expressible with language, which you partially already addressed, but more an idea that exists already, or is it throughout of this process of limiting or drawing the borders that the idea becomes, or how would you address? How would you say that?
So I think the limits, the idea of limiting is to do with two things. And one is just the vast empty expanse of manuscript paper or time that you have when you sit down to write a piece. Before you have the idea and you know that there's a deadline for a piece and you've got to write something, it's the endless possibility of what you could do, and so you have to start kind of whittling away at that, and some of those decisions are made for you, like the duration of something, often the instrumentation. You might at least have a limit of what you can do. Like if you're writing for symphony orchestra, you'll have the lineup of the forces or particular ensemble. And yeah, so it's partly just kind of thinking, well, okay, so once I start adding in these sort of restrictions that almost like these guardrails, that gives me conversely actually more freedom then to play about within them. So I think sort of as you tighten control of one aspect, you allow freedom of another, and it's that sort of tension, I guess, between freedom and control, which played a big part in the work that we did last year at abeceda. That was like a really key thing. So that's one side of it, and then the other is, I think, about sort of being economic with material. And I mentioned that I kind of had this issue, or I reached this point as a composer when I was quite young. I felt like I just throw ideas at a piece. I get stuck at a point and I think, well, okay, I'll just come up with a new idea, a new motive, a new melody, theme, something, and it sort of feels I don't know, maybe I started feeling that maybe there's only so many ideas you get in your life musically, and you might put all of them into this one piece and then that's it and you're done. And I think also just essence, like when an idea comes to me, I feel like I have a responsibility to do it justice and see, like, sort of try and tease out as much potential as possible. So if I have this, I know, like this 4-bar phrase, for example, I don't just leave it as this, like, this is a 4-bar phrase and it's just going to be this tiny little speck in this piece of music. I'm like, okay, I want this to feel integral to the work. I want each bar to feel like it needs to be there and it belongs there. And so if something feels like very different from that, I then have to consider, okay, is that because this piece of music is going to go in that direction, or have I now got two pieces of music that I'm working with? So it's thinking about that, and I suppose, trying to keep like a consistent identity to the work and avoiding the sort of like the arguments that you sometimes find in contemporary music, which I think sort of stems from perhaps like classical sonata forms. You have your like first idea, your second idea, you like mix them both together in the development, and they're sort of fighting each other, sort of like dialectical thing. And I guess I just kind of fell out of admiration with that, and then decided that actually I really like these very long evolving things.
So where does the identity of the composition come from?
I think it is the processes themselves, and so that, I guess, that takes us from those two pieces I mentioned earlier to the equivocation of time. We did at abeceda, because that was the two pieces I mentioned earlier, Archalis, Epiradialis. What I would say about those is, in a sense, like, although I want each bar to feel like it's very integral to the work and should be there, they're also almost arbitrary in the sense that it is one particular derivation of a process. And now that I've written those and I know the process, if I lost all the scores and all the parts and had to recreate them, I could probably do essentially the same piece, but then there might be actually quite significant differences in the actual notes that are there. But because it's a process, like it means that you still get the same sense of structure, you still get kind of the same harmonic language, but the actual like minute details become slightly unimportant almost, which I can understand is perhaps frustrating to a performer because it obviously, like, some of these processes, particularly when you want to get to these very big, thick, chaotic textures, everybody's doing something different. It's very difficult to figure out where you're lining up, and that's a really big challenge as a performer. And I know that as a performer myself. And so when it's an effect that you're going for, I start to feel like I kind of want to allow the performers to de-stress and not feel like I've got to get every note of this very complicated pattern absolutely correct, in a way that you might with I know, like Boulez. I think, a lot of Birtwistle's music is a lot like that, where you have to be very, very precise with it, and the precision is kind of not the point necessarily, at least that in parts of that. So what I was looking at with the work for abeceda was how do I kind of take those idea processes and try and notate more of the process rather than the sort of the realization of the process. And so I started exploring that a little bit more with the notation and think about like how does that structure work, and that also can be a huge challenge as well. A lot of musicians, classically trained musicians, particularly a lot of contemporary performers that I've worked with, like we're trained to read music, and when something is a little bit abstract and you have to be a little bit creative and use improvisation, there are some fantastic performers who love working like that, and some people who just think, look, just tell me what I need to do and when, and so it's about sort of trying to find the right balance between what's essentially like the sweet spot of material that you need to give to the performers, that they understand what they need to do and they can realize this process themselves in real time, rather than me sort of going and meticulously notate everything and then rely on a conductor beating time, because actually you're not necessarily going to hear all of these points as an ensemble yourselves. But when you have the freedom and you kind of know this is where it starts and this is where it ends up and this is how it moves, and you're explicitly given the freedom to say, well, this can be a bit longer or shorter, this is where you line up again, that I think that works quite well. And I felt very sort of confident in the musicians I was working with in Bled, that having like spoken to you all and had conversations and workshops, I thought, okay, this is definitely something that I can explore with these people. I think they'll react really well to it. And I was right.
It's an honor to work with composers like that. And as you mentioned, you are a performer yourself, still active, right, as a pianist?
Yeah, very, very much so. I start off as a kind of concert solo pianist at music school, and then started to move much more towards collaborative piano at university, particularly contemporary music. So I did a lot of contemporary music. That was really my focus for about 5 years. Worked with a lot of student contemporary ensembles, contemporary music festivals, did the London Symphony Academy and things like that. So that was like the next phase. And then at present, I'm focusing a lot on working with vocalists, opera, song, repetitoring and things like that. So it's transforming as I go along.
Is there something that you think you could only notice as a performer, especially now in the context of classical music, of the contemporary classical music?
I think every musician is different and has their own wealth of experience to draw upon. So I wouldn't say that there's something that like only I specifically could notice or experience. I think there's something about composers who exclusively compose. I mean, I think every composer is a performer in some way, or began as an instrumentalist in some manner. But I think there is certainly somewhere that is very much like on the side, and they haven't kind of developed it necessarily to like a professional performing level, because their kind of professional practice, their main practice is composing. And I think that's actually really fascinating as well, because that is a very different perspective on writing. I think that's driven composing in contemporary classical music forward in a really interesting way, because you can think outside the box a little more. Equally, I think having experience either as a performer or as a conductor, and knowing what it's like in the rehearsal room to put something together, and particularly actually before you get into the rehearsal room and you are given a score and you think, like, how do I make sense of that? I think it does change you as it changes you as a composer, because you're thinking maybe in a slightly different way. I'm not sure I could have written The Equivocation of Time without being a performer and done it quite as successful, at least for the first time. I think that would have been something where I might have had the ideas for it and thought, I'll just kind of leave them to work it out in the rehearsal room, and probably not quite realise practically what was needed. Mm-hmm. So I think thinking about it, if I was given this score, what would I think about it? What would I ask from it initially? And would I get the answers that I need? Or would I turn up with one idea and someone says a completely different idea and it sort of falls apart? So that's certainly a big part of it. I think, particularly now I work with lots of singers, I think that is a very unique insight into how the classically trained voice works. That it's a huge subject, because the voice is so individual anyway. Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of composers really struggle with, at least initially. And one way around it is, you just find a performer to collaborate closely with, and you kind of go backwards and forwards. But understanding kind of what goes through a singer's mind when they're sort of trying to work on a piece and learn it, and the way they're trained as musicians and what they think about, and like there's a huge amount of complexity that goes into it that I think they don't always get given full credit for, the amount, like the technique and everything they have to think about just to make a sound and make a good sound. And then a composer kind of throws all of this extra stuff at them. And again, I want to be not necessarily gentle with musicians, but I want to be understanding, and I want to feel like any challenge that I give to somebody is worthwhile. It's not just because I want it this way and it's your job to make it happen. It's like I want to know what I'm asking of the performer, so that when a challenge comes up, I can say, yeah, I know how much of a challenge this is, but I also understand how important it is to this music that you try and do that, or this is what I'm trying to achieve, and we need to find a better way around it, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the perks of working with live composers is that you can clarify yourself on the spot whether something is not to be altered or altered in any way, or if there's a different way to create on the spot to achieve perhaps not the same but the result that you're striving for. Noticing as a performer. So to continue, perhaps to the overview of your compositional work, addressing the main aspects, the things that are most important to you in a work. Let's say we already went through a couple of them. If you were continuing with making this overview, what is it that you would say, okay, I have to mention this if I speak of my compositional practice?
That is a very difficult question to answer. I'm not sure I have an answer for you on that, because we talked about structure. We talked a lot about identity of works, and I guess keeping each idea sort of almost like quite self-contained, trying to like take that idea and fill it up to its potential. We talked about that. I think the idea that the performers have some freedom to interpret, that is actually something that I think is quite important to my work, at least now. I think there was a point where I probably over-notated a lot, or I lent into musically complex language, not just because it was like the sound I wanted to create, but also in terms of like notation, feeling that the more information you put on a page, the more protected you are as a composer, because it's all like you work everything out in advance, and I think that's a sort of a fear of musicians. Fear of perform, or a fear of getting into a rehearsal room, because you mentioned that it's nice to work with composers who are living. You can talk to them and understand their ideas and what can be changed, what can't, and actually that can be the hardest part of working between composer performers, and I know that still, that having done both sides, and that first rehearsal is always very fraught, because if it's the first time the group is singing the music and the composer's there, and you kind of know it's not going to work first. The first time you play through it, it's stuff is going to be a bit messy, it's going to be tightening up, and it can be a little bit cagey. And the problem you have as composers is you spend so much time with like living this creation in your head, and for me it's it is typically a process of months, like writing a piece of music, and then as it grows, you kind of, the initial seed of like the idea that you had, with like maybe that process or like what you wanted to achieve, sort of gets lost a little bit. Like the idea is like you notate everything down on the page, so it's there and it becomes permanent. And then once you kind of reach that finished score, to try and look back and interpret that score and understand what it was you were thinking at the time, that can be quite difficult. And so when you're in a rehearsal and put on the spot and said, what are you trying to do here? How should we do this? And everything. It's quite scary. It's quite difficult to put it into words. Composers we write music. Everything goes into the music, and words aren't necessarily our strong point. And I'm reminded of I think it's a David Lynch quote, where he's being asked about explaining his movies, and I can't remember the exact words, but the gist of it is like, why would you talk about a movie? Why would you explain a movie? The movie is the talking. That is it, and then it's for somebody else to look at and try and understand for themselves. And for me, like, writing music has been a little bit like that. So I think I went from that very strictly notated, like, just the more information I put on the page, the more I can just like deflect to that and say to the performers, like, it's just there. That's a septuplet, just played as a septuplet with the crescendos written. The more specific it is, the more I can get away from almost like having to understand what I'm trying to do. And I think as I've relaxed more as a composer, I've been a lot more comfortable with allowing performers that freedom. And that has, I think, also come from the performers that I've worked with. I think when you're working with student performers who are not necessarily very familiar with contemporary music and find themselves sort of confronted by it, they're looking for like help and guidance on how to perform it, and the person they think to go to first is the composer, and you're also sort of learning and developing at the same time. And then I think as I've been able to work with more experienced performers who, they typically have, a great love for contemporary music, and they're very open-minded, and they do want to bring their own ideas to things. Suddenly I feel like, oh, that's good. It's not just about me and what I think. Like, now I feel like the performers themselves have this input. So that's, I think, like a big part of what is important for me now in the music that I'm writing. Certainly, like, for the past few years, thinking about like who the performers are, and writing stuff that is quite specific to them or that performance that they're doing. Like, it feels like that is the piece that has to be written for that environment.
Yeah, 'cause in a sense, that is the beauty of being the composer, because yes, there are also very practical aspects that are perhaps more comfortable for performers. But in the end, it's true, you write it in the composition, and it's also an entirely legit option to write everything in and not say a word about it outside of the score, as well as the complete opposite. Before, it came to my mind what a curious composition note or a program note it would be if you just published the process of finding the name of the composition. Perhaps someone has done that already. But to continue, perhaps a word or two to where you see your goals in composition. And what is it, perhaps, if there's something specific in the skill set that you're developing and that you see you're taking somewhere, that you see your next 1 or 10 or 100 compositions having that in. as well as like, do you ever consider what is it ultimately that you are doing? A bit of a larger question, thought.
Yeah. I'd say I'm not the kind of person in general who is very kind of directional or necessarily like goal orientated and things like this is where I'm going and this is exactly how I'm going to get there. I like finding out. I like the journey. I like not quite knowing what the end point is going to be. I think that's true of the music that I write. I think that's true of like kind of how I've put together my career and kind of like my philosophy, I guess, for like how I go through life in a way. So I don't know what my next 100 pieces will be. I'm quite surprised at the work I'm doing at the moment because I'm now kind of moving towards art song, which is never something that I expected I would be doing like even a few years ago. I remember the first
art song.
Art song like Lieder,
Ah,
things like that. Yes, and that's come about specifically because I've now been working more with singers and familiarise myself with a lot of that historical repertoire, and I just, because I know now so many singers and they hear I write music and they say, oh, have you got any songs I could perform? And I don't. So part of it is just a practical thing of like, I have this opportunity to get my music out there and performed. So obviously I want to take that. And I think sort of then that's a way of me exploring my relationship with this repertoire and kind of what it means to me and what it means to the present day. And I'm not sure like what I will think about this project or these works kind of when I'm done, and whether I'll think, yeah, they're really like integral parts of my output, or they're actually just little exercises and
it's a very canonical form, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why I avoided it for such a long time. And I'm working with the voice in general, actually. So I remember the first serious piece that I wrote for voice was as a postgraduate, or just as I finished postgraduate study, and I was doing a residency at Roymont, which is a composition and new music performance program that happens in France. And it was with Juliet Fraser and Quator Tana, so voice and string quartet. And because I've been working so much with process at that time, and the idea of sort of avoiding meaning, like keeping things abstract, and the idea that it's almost like a kind of like semantic unintelligibility, I suppose. And one of the first problems I have, like when it comes to writing for voice, is, well, you have text, and text generally does have meaning. Oh, yeah. And you've got to find some text that you like. You've got to get the rights and all of that practical thing. And I got around that by doing this very like deconstructed sound world and exploring the boundaries between the human voice and the acoustic instrument, and trying to blur the boundaries between the two. And I remember, I think Julius Lorenz last year when he was presenting, he was exploring similar ideas, I think, with some of his work. So that was how I was dealing with the issue at that time, and still kind of going down this very abstract route, because I think I was like, what I definitely don't want to do is write song and write this very canonical art form and sort of tread this same path that's already been trod. And it is very interesting working with text, because the things I'm doing at the moment, they're very they're poems. So one of them is exploring some of the Goethe Mignon poetry, which has been set by Beethoven and Schubert and Wolf. Liszt, I think, has some song settings and some of his students, and it's one of the most popular texts to set. So that, you know, it's about as canonical, I think, as you can get. And another project is working with a friend of mine who's a writer and doing some sort of poetry or like song performance in English. And so, you know, these are words that have meaning and have structure already. So I don't get to sort of have so much of a say in the structure of it, because that's something that is already pre-existing. So that's something that I'm quite surprised at now, and I think that's kind of what I see myself as a composer. Is I do like to surprise myself. I like to start off with something and think, I don't know quite if this is going to work. You know, I'm sort of almost, everything is like a kind of an exercise of working something out or working through a problem, and then once I finish that piece, it's sort of like, well, I've now done that problem. You know, I've worked my way through it, so now I have to find a different problem. It might be related, or it might be something completely the opposite, completely new, or something. I suppose it's like the challenge of it, just writing pieces just for the sake of it. That doesn't really appeal to me. I think particularly in this day and age where we have such a big canon of music and so much has been documented and notated and recorded, and there's more music that exists now than we will ever have the chance to listen to in our lifetimes, let alone if you want to perform it and have to learn all that. It's simply impossible. So it feels almost kind of wasteful and gratuitous to be too prolific. I think that to me belongs in a time where, you know, music was constantly being created new for new performances, like, you know, in the classical period. You know, Haydn symphonies and string quartets and things like that, where there wasn't really the expectation of any kind of posterity or preservation necessarily beyond the composer's life, or even maybe like a particular performance. Now it feels like there's this huge library of work, and if you're going to add something to that, to me, I want to feel like anything I add has to be worthwhile, or at least worthwhile to me. So even if it's something that I eventually think, well, you know, that turned out really crap, and, you know, I never want to see that piece again, I want to at least feel like I've got something else to experience of writing it.
Curious. Unless you don't publish it.
Well, of course, yeah, and there's always, you know, you can just retract lots of music. You know, I know there are plenty of composers who do that. I mentioned Birtwistle earlier, and there's an awful lot of Birtwistle's music that you can find references to of stuff that's been performed, and there are just no scores available. It's not in the catalogue, and so it's clearly something that was performed once, maybe a couple of times, and then he's just completely pulled the piece.
So you mentioned also this positive treatment of a problem and resolving them. Is there any of those that persists or that keeps appearing in different works?
I mean, the structural question is definitely something that I keep coming back to, and the idea of organising things, organising material, organising performers, and hierarchies. I think, like, who, you know, kind of flows of power and relations of power in that in the concert environments. Whether, you know, you have the conductor, you have the composer, the performers, the audience, and, you know, where the sort of like authority or even like authorship lies in that environment, which is not something that is unique to me, for sure. Like, there are lots of composers who like to explore that, and some go like a lot further than I do, but it's something I like to keep in mind, because it's, yeah, I think it can starts becoming quite solipsistic as a composer to be too dictatorial about exactly how something should be. And that's something that is certainly is not just a part of contemporary music, but is very, very much a part of the canon of music as well, is the idea that, you know, all of these historical great works are untouchable and they've been performed so magnificently that essentially our task now is to recreate those past performances. And that's something that I don't particularly like and doesn't really resonate with me as an artist and as a musician. I think it's great to like, take music and find your own way into it and certainly change things around. And I do like that when performers do want to do that with my music. Obviously, like if you get one performance of a work that you created and that might be the only performance you get, you do want it to be as close to your idea as possible. But I think certainly, like if you have any ambition for a work to sort of sustain a life beyond that premiere performance, you want it to be something that performers, you know, are excited about interacting with. Like you want them to interact with the music, not just kind of passively let it go move through them.
Always. Then at this point, I would move to the conclusion, and that is always the two questions. I would ask you for two messages, one for any aspiring composers, and the second one to any listeners, future listeners, perhaps listeners following up listening to this conversation of your work.
Sure. Again, more questions that I find really difficult to answer. I think my advice to composers would probably be that I think it's very easy to be influenced by what is around you in a negative way. And because like we all want to have some kind of like success with what we do, and it's very easy to try and like follow the tropes of, well, I can see what is getting performed and you know what's getting celebrated and reviewed and everything like that. And it's quite trite advice really. I think it's advice I was given like numerous times as well as a young composer, like finding your own voice. But I think it's basically you just have to exist within music in your musical sphere for long enough that the things that you are drawn to are drawn to you. Like you find what those are, because it's not necessarily going to be the things that you thought at 18 or 20 or like any particular age, and it can keep changing, keep developing. So I think keeping that open mind about who and what you are and what you're doing, and also like being prepared to walk away from it actually and take time away, which is very easy for me to say because I have this like separate practice to perform, and I very much do that and bounce from one to the other depending on what sort of feels like it's enriching me the most. But I think as a composer you can get very drawn to like, this is just what I do, and your identity gets so tied up in that sometimes you forget that like you don't always have to be writing a piece of music, and you can still be thinking and experiencing in the way of a composer, and eventually like, if the music is meant to be written, like you will find a way to write it. And then the second one was advice for any listeners, which is, I suppose, not specifically for listeners to my music, but I think music in general, which is just listen to, again, like what you find rewarding. It's always nice, like when somebody says, like, I really loved your music, but that's not particularly what I write for. I do want my music to be approachable in some way. Like, I don't want to like alienate people, but equally if somebody it says like I just hate this is terrible, I'm like, there's no music that will suit everybody. So I actually like, if you hate my music, I embrace you. I embrace you like disliking it and go listen to something else you like. Like, I'd much rather you do that than struggle through something you don't. And I think that again, that's also advice I think for musicians and for composers as well. That's also good advice. Is not every bit of music is for everybody else, and the more we can embrace that and appreciate that and tolerate that, I think the better that our whole musical ecosystem will be.
Dan Lee Chappell, thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you.